Thank you for joining us for Pet Connect. I'm Tara Douglas. We've got some really cold weather coming into this area of Alabama this week. I want to talk about ways that you can protect your animals. I know that we have a lot of our viewers that have outside dogs and cats, and so we've got to think about what to do for our pets during this time of year, and especially when we've got weather like we have this coming in this weekend. So first of all, make sure that you do everything you can to keep your pet dry and also keep them out of the wind, because that means that they can be safe if they're dry and out of the wind. If they are wet and if they are in the wind, then that can be a disaster. So just make sure that as you're thinking about that, and just have a shelter that can provide all those different things. So when you're getting a shelter or building a shelter for your animal, try to keep it off of the ground, number one, because we've got to keep the animals warm. And if that shelter is sitting on dirt, if it's sitting on concrete, it's going to leach a lot of that warmth out of it. So if you have it raised, you can put it on some kind of 2x4s, you can get foam padding, you can get some of those crates, the pallets that they can sit on. Anything like that, just a few inches off the ground can make all the difference in the world. Now also make sure that you keep the wind blocked. Before we talk about the bedding, wind blocked, so try to find a spot for it where it's out of the wind. If you can't keep it completely out of the wind, then at least the opening, try to make sure that the opening to that shelter is where the wind's not going to be whipping in on the dog. And if you've got access to some kind of flap or plastic that you can put over the opening to the shelter, then that is great. So make sure that you figure out some way to keep the dog warm in there. Now, speaking of warmth, we skipped over that second thing on our graphic there, the straw. So here's a listing of the different types of bedding. A lot of people think that blankets are great, that hay is great. Hay and blankets both get really too wet and can freeze and create a much worse situation for your dog than probably having nothing at all. So avoid blankets, avoid hay. Hay is for feeding animals, not for trying to give them the insulation. Think about straw. And when I say straw, think about the grain kind of straw, because that straw is going to be a tube, and so it's going to have that air inside of it, and that air will help insulate. And straw typically stays fairly dry, and so it'll continue to insulate for the dog. You'll want to have several inches of it, so 4 to 6 inches usually fine. Bigger dogs, you might have to have more, but if you have access to straw, please choose that one. That is number one best. Now, we have a lot of pine straw around here, so pine straw is acceptable in a pinch. So it's not the best, but it will work. Now, the pine straw, you'll need more of it, so make sure that you have maybe 10 inches of it in that shelter. And keep checking it though, because pine straw, of course, can get damp, so you want to change it out periodically. Make sure that you constantly have enough straw in there and that you can move it in and out. But by all means, avoid hay and avoid any kind of blankets, because we've got to keep the animals, like we said, wet is not safe, so we've got to keep them dry. Also, hay, think about that. If you leave it in too long, it can mold. So you definitely want to choose a straw kind of option. That's going to be the best. Now, think about also, you want to make sure that if you've got a shelter that is not great with wind, you can always put a plastic tarp over it. The tarps will help block a lot of that so that you can have that wind blocking ability. And make sure that if you're going to use any sort of heat source in that shelter, if you've got straw in there or something like that, don't put a heat lamp in there. They will be fine. And you want to make sure the shelter is also pretty small, because a big roomy doghouse is not great this time of year. We definitely want a smaller. They need more of an insulated cave right now. So just make it big enough for your dog to get in there, curl up in a ball, and stay warm. Now, other things that you can think of this time of year. They need water. So don't think that just because it's cold outside, your dog doesn't want to drink. Your dog definitely needs to stay hydrated, because they can't get dehydrated this time of year either. So try to choose a water dish that is less likely to freeze. If you can get a heated water dish, well then of course that's great. We all wish we had a heated water dish. But otherwise, try to get a plastic container or a rubber container. It'll take longer for those to freeze. And if you have a metal one, it's going to freeze pretty quickly. But change out that water frequently. Make sure that they have access to actual liquid water and not have it frozen sitting there for them. And dogs also need a lot of calories this time of year when they're cold, and especially if you give them extra food at night. One thing that can happen is when they're digesting their food, they can really build up their body heat. So if you feed them later, that's going to be best. So we've got all kinds of things that can really help you keep that dog safe and warm. Don't just assume that because a dog has fur that the dog is going to be just fine. So we want to make sure that they stay dry and they stay out of the wind regardless of fur. And consider, I know it's too late right now because it's about to get cold quick, but consider not shaving your dogs during the winter if possible. And of course, that bottom one on our graphic here, bring them inside. That is going to be the #1 thing to keep your dog safe and warm. Bring them inside if possible. I know that's not always possible, but that would be the #1 answer to this. Now, if your dog is outside, watch for signs of danger because, again, they can get frostbite, they can get hypothermic. So the areas of their bodies that can get it first are the tips of the tails, the tips of the ears, their paws, their nose. So really watch if your dog starts limping, then they might have some frostbite on the paws. If you start seeing a color change in their skin tone in those areas, if it gets kind of bluish or gray, then they might be getting hypothermic, or they definitely are. So check them out, bring them in. And if they get lethargic, if they're weak, if they are just laying around, then you've definitely got to take action. So of course you can bring them in, slowly warm them up. Don't bring them in and put them in a hot bath or get a hair dryer out and try to warm them. All of that could create some issues where it could shock their bodies if you warm them up too quickly. And by all means, if you're worried about your dog, if something has happened, call your vet, call the emergency vet. Really try to do what you can to take good care of them during this cold weather. Now, if you see a dog in your neighborhood, or if you pass a dog that you feel like doesn't have all of these different wonderful winter survival things on this checklist, then if it's safe to approach that neighbor or to talk to that person, then by all means offer some support, because we need to help each other out, and they may not have access to straw. They may not know how to build a shelter. And if you can help them, do that, because people are going to respond so much quicker and better to support than they will to accusations or anything like that. So, but if you feel like a dog that is out doesn't have access to the straw, doesn't have access to all of these wonderful shelter options, it's okay to call the shelter and talk to animal control. Our animal control officer will be happy to go out and check the situation and see what he can do to help that person out also, to make sure that the outside dog is safe. So just keep in mind, and one other thing that I didn't mention, if you can keep your dogs off of chains right now, but also contained, then that is going to be much better than having them on a chain. They can't get movement enough to really warm up if they're on a chain, and then oftentimes that if they're on a chain, they can't get into any kind of enclosure that they have in an adequate way to stay warm.